So looking at these assignments, so how do we implement data to an HTML table? I've shown you that. SQL implementation in Python. So how do you do SQL with Python? Doing SQL with Python is not required. I would say if you want to do that, look at, so there are ways of doing that, but don't use an actual database server. That is going to be causing lots of headaches with actually marking it, for example. If you want to use SQL, use something like SQLite. It is a local database. But if you do SQL, you're getting a lot more complexity. If you want to store your state, which again you don't have to, you can use files. As there are the lecture slides that you can use, but again it's not required. Node.js. So what is Node.js? Node.js is a web server written in JavaScript. So yes, we won't be using that for this particular unit, obviously, because we're using Python. Personally, I don't like the whole idea of Node.js. JavaScript is a language that that works reasonably well for small scripting environments, but it is a very forgiving language that doesn't really have the tools to have a compiler check that your code is correct. So, and it certainly has also speed limitations. So personally, I don't like it as a server. Doesn't matter. But and so Node.js is running JavaScript on a server. How you use it, I'm not an expert in it at all. I don't like it. I've never used it really. So I can't cover that in the lecture. It's kind of off topic as well. The advantage is, yes, you can use the same language as the front end of the back end. There's other ways you can do that with other languages that then compile into JavaScript. So jQuery, yes, so I'm not a jQuery expert. jQuery is a tool that can make certain, so it's a library that wraps around certain ways of accessing stuff. You're allowed to use it, don't have to use it. There are things that are slightly different. For this assignment, I would say jQuery is overkill. jQuery and similar libraries, they become really powerful at the point where you want to support many different browsers, including very old ones. Old browsers don't necessarily support all functionality that new ones do, and jQuery is a library that can kind of paper over that difference and make it all work the same. So routing interaction with the front end. So I showed you how to do this in a basic form, but have a look at the Flask documentation as well. If you want to know exactly how to specify your routes, etc., you can look at that documentation. Yes, it's a little bit much sometimes, but you look at the right thing. And reading documentation is actually an important programming skill. How to use Flask, how to create a Python backend. We kind of covered that. Okay, I didn't cover here how to create the Flask application. Yes, the easy way is to use PyCharm for it. There's some guidance online already how to do that, some videos. I would say PyCharm Professional is free. You can get you can freely apply with your university email for a year-long license to it. So so how do we so yeah, I'll come back to the questions later. I'll do look at that. All of programming. Yes, I can't really cover all of programming, but one thing I would like to stress with programming is a thinking skill, and especially as a beginning programmer, what you want to do, you almost want to skip the computer for the first step and say, okay, what do I actually need to do here? What is the functionality I want? And only later link that to how can I actually make that work in this particular language, whether it be JavaScript, Java, or Python. So think about what you need to happen, and then think about how it happens. An important part with that as well is the idea of variables. Variables store data, but they are not values. So we have values which are data, and variables are a way of storing that data. And of course, and retrieving that data, because variables have a name that you can then use to get the data that was in that variable or a parameter. So variables and values. So the relevant Flask task we need. So here's basically the last exercise on so Flask that you basically want to start with. So Python exercises, and then the last week I talked about Flask. I would say there is no separate Flask exercise, but you have some starting point. You can look at the slides or at the video, how it works, and try and look at, okay, yes, I can do this myself. What does need to be done to the assignment? Well, the brief exactly tells you that. You need to implement these features. So how do you do that? Well, you start with one and then you gradually move to the next ones. You can first stick with the regress API until you have the backend API implemented. You can do first the front end, as you did with the last JavaScript exercise, where you already created the front end. I recreated a little bit here, but you should already have that front end as part of your exercise. And now we need to replace ResRec with the actual backend by basically replicating what regress does, or ResRec does, in your backend, as I showed you an example before. The checklist is the features that are in your assignment brief. So yes, so this is more an observation. It's not really a suggestion. I can't really teach this, but yes, I am aware that there's a big difference between students who haven't done things before and who have. And that is a big challenge. And I've seen some questions from people that say, okay, yeah, certainly they know what they're doing. If you're lost, then you are not going to ask, how can I use SQL in this? So how do you get started if you're not doing this step by step, and make sure you not only have done the exercises, but understand the exercises? A big mistake I see many students make with doing their programming is that they try to actually see what does the code, but how just copy pasting code without trying to understanding it. Very important is that you understand what is going on, and one of the ways you do that is by playing around with it. So what happens if I change this? What happens if I change that? What happens if I change that? By doing that and by experimenting with your code, you get to learn it better. So what are the topics relevant to the assignment? Well, how do you write Python? How do you write JavaScript? How do you make your JavaScript actually make requests? How do you update your HTML? So that's what the exercises were for. The exercises were really an exercise in learning how to make your application work. So, and then the data comes from the browser, etc. So, how to put a put request? Well, like I said, you just put in where it says get. But updating a current bit of data, that should be a post request. Normally. You can also say, so it can be a post request on the user. A put would be something like we said, we would need an equivalent representation. So you need to put, so if you want to say, okay, I want to just change the username, you say post username equals, well, so you put a post request where the post has username as a parameter, and put that as the data. Or you can return use a put with the entire new replacement data. A post can have only the change data, whereas a put needs to have the full replacement data. So why are we using Flask? So part of the purpose of Flask is those ILOs. We have 4 ILOs, and including the one that says we must have you multiple languages. That's the contract that we have with your code. So we need to meet that. That's what the unit is, the unit specification, and we teach that we need to meet that specification. How do you use it without PyCharm? So PyCharm is an editor. It's a very, very powerful editor, and it has all kind of nice ways to make developing Flask, etc. easier. But you can just run Flask from the command line to run your application. There is some guidance available, and if you get stuck, ask in Virtual P201, but most of you should already have figured that out. So important thing is whatever you develop in PyCharm can still be run from the command line or in other ways. PyCharm is just a very powerful editor. It doesn't run your code, it just allows you to edit it. And yes, it has a run button that calls Python to run it. So it remembers and it knows how to put the right command line arguments together, but it isn't your code. So Flask in depth. So the way we set up the assignment is that we actually want you to use Flask as little as possible, basically. So we need to make those requests, make it work, but you don't need to go into the depth of Flask. You need to be able to get your data from your request, and that's about it almost. And your routing. So the backend API section, I've covered that a little bit. So how to use the XML HTTP request? Well, you pass in the URL that you need to use, and then you tell it what method you have, and then when it you tell it what it needs, what function it needs to perform when it finishes. How to get Flask and Java working together, I've covered that as well. The whole assignment piece, I'm really struggling with it. So yes, for those kind of things, try to really understand what we've been talking about. Make sure you understand the components. If necessary, go back to the lectures on that. How does HTML work? How does CSS work? How does simple JavaScript work? And if there's unclear things, you can ask a quick question, get it answered quickly. But oh, I have no idea where to start. That's a hard one to answer. How do you start off? How to create the API and integrate it? Well, you start with the first function that calls regress and replace that, and then you just work through your JavaScript and replace all the bits of regress by Python by first implementing that in Python, and then making sure that it works by calling it from the JavaScript API. Just from top to bottom. That's the way I would do it. So and create it. So yes, this is already in the examples. Yes, so working it together. I hopefully show that it's not in PowerPoint though.